surprised by joy, the shape of my early life by Professor C.S. Lewis of Magdalene College, Oxford University, London. Chapter 2. Concentration Camp. Arithmetic with colored rods. Times Educational Supplement, November 19, 1954. Clop, 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 clop. We are in a four-wheeler rattling over the uneven square sets of the Belfast streets through the damp twilight of a September evening, 1908. My father, my brother, and I am going to school for the first time. We are in low spirits. My brother, who has most reason to be so, for he alone knows what we are going to, shows his feelings least. He is already a veteran. I perhaps am buoyed up by a little excitement, but very little. The most important fact at the moment is the horrible clothes I have been made to put on. Only this morning, only 2 hours ago, I was running wild in shorts and blazer and sand shoes. Now I am choking and sweating, itching too, in thick dark stuff, throttled by an Eton collar, my feet already aching with unaccustomed boots. I am wearing knickerbockers that button at the knee. Every night for some 40 weeks of every year, and for many a year, I am to see the red smarting imprint of those buttons in my flesh when I undress. Worst of all is the bowler the bowler hat, apparently made of iron, which grasps my head. I have read of boys in the same predicament who welcomed such things as signs of growing up. I had no such feeling. Nothing in my experience had ever suggested to me that it was nicer to be a schoolboy than a child, or nicer to be a man than a schoolboy. My brother never talked much about school in the holidays. My father, whom I implicitly believed represented adult life as one of incessant drudgery under the continual threat of financial ruin. In this, he did not mean to deceive us. Such was his temperament that when he exclaimed, as he frequently did, "There will soon be nothing for it but the workhouse," he momentarily believed, or at least felt, what he said. I took it all literally and had the gloomiest anticipation of adult life. In the meantime, the putting on of the school clothes was, I well knew, the assumption of a prison uniform. We reach the quay and go on board the old Fleetwood boat. We reach the quay and go on board the old Fleetwood boat. After some miserable strolling about the deck, my father bids us goodbye. He is deeply moved. I, alas, am mainly embarrassed and self-conscious. When he has gone ashore, we almost, by comparison, cheer up. My brother begins to show me over the ship and tell me about all the other shipping in sight. He is an experienced traveler and a complete man of the world. A certain agreeable excitement steals over me. I like the reflected port and starboard lights on the oily water, the rattle of winches, the warm smell from the engine room skylight. We cast off. The black space widens between us and the quay. 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 I feel the throb of screws underneath me. I feel the throb of screws underneath me. Soon we are dropping down the log, L-O-U-G-H, log, and there is a taste of salt on one's lips, and that cluster of lights astern receding from us is everything I have known. Later, when we have gone to our bunks, it begins to blow. It is a rough night and my brother is seasick. I absurdly envy him this accomplishment. He is behaving as experienced travelers should. By great efforts, I succeed in vomiting, but it is a poor affair. I was and am an obstinately good sailor. By great efforts, I succeed in vomiting, but it is a poor affair. I was and am an obstinately good sailor. No Englishman will be able to understand my first impressions of England. When we disembarked, I suppose, at about 6 next morning, but it seemed to be midnight. I found myself in a world to which I reacted with immediate hatred. The flats of Lancashire in the early morning are in reality a dismal sight. To me, they were like the banks of Styx, S-T-Y-X. The strange English accents with which I was surrounded seemed like the voices of demons. But what was worst was the English landscape. From Fleetwood to Euston, E-U-S-T-O-N. Even to my adult eye, that main line still appears to run through the dullest and most unfriendly strip in the island. But to a child who had always lived near the sea and in sight of high ridges, it appeared, as I suppose Russia might appear to an English boy. The flatness the interminableness, the miles and miles of featureless land shutting one in from the sea, imprisoning, suffocating. Everything was wrong. Wooden fences instead of stone walls and hedges, red brick farmhouses instead of white cottages, the fields too big, haystacks the wrong shape. Well does the Kalevala say that in the stranger's house the floor is full of knots, KNOTS. I have made up the quarrel since. I have made up the quarrel since. But at that moment I conceived a hatred for England which took many years to heal. Our destination was the little town of, let us call it, Belsen, in Hertfordshire, Green Hertfordshire. Lamb calls it, but it was not green to a boy bred in County Down. It was flat Hertfordshire, plenty Hertfordshire of the yellow soil. There is the same difference between the climate of Ireland and of England as between that of England and the continent. There was far more weather at Belsen than I had ever met before. There I first knew bitter frost and stinging fog, sweltering heat and thunderstorms on the great scale. There, through the curtainless dormitory windows, I first came to know the ghastly beauty of the full moon. The school, as I first knew it, consisted of some 8 or 9 boarders and about as many day boys. Organized games, except for endless rounders in the flinty playground, had long been moribund and were finally abandoned not very long after my arrival. There was no bathing except once weekly bath in the bathroom. I was already doing Latin exercises as taught by my mother when I went there in 1908, and I was still doing Latin exercises when I left there in 1910. I had never got in sight of a Roman author. The only stimulating element in the teaching consisted of a few well-used canes which hung on the green iron chimneypiece of the single schoolroom. The teaching staff consisted of the headmaster and proprietor. We called him Oldie, his grown-up son, Vivi, and an usher. The ushers succeeded one another with great rapidity. One lasted for less than a week. Another was dismissed in the presence of the boys with a rider from Oldie to the effect that if he were not in holy orders, he would kick him downstairs. This curious scene took place in the dormitory, though I cannot remember why. All these ushers, within brackets, except the one who stayed less than a week, bracket close, were obviously as much in awe of Oldie as we. But there came a time when there were no more ushers, and Oldie's youngest daughter taught the junior pupils. By that time there were only 5 boarders, and Oldie finally gave up his school and sought a cure of souls. I was one of the last survivors. I was one of the last survivors and left the ship only when she went down under us. Oldie lived in a solitude of power like a sea captain in the days of sail. No man or woman in that house spoke to him as an equal. No one except we initiated conversation with him at all. At meal times, we boys had a glimpse of his family life. His son sat on his right hand. They two had separate food. His wife and 3 grown-up daughters, silent within brackets, the usher, silent within brackets, and the boys within brackets, silent, munched their inferior messes. His wife, though I think she never addressed Goldie, was allowed to make something of a reply to him. The girls, 3 tragic features. The girls, 3 tragic figures, dressed summer and winter in the same shabby black, never went beyond an almost whispered yes papa or no papa. Never went beyond an almost whispered yes papa or no papa. On the rare occasions when they were addressed, few visitors entered the house. Beer, which Oldie and Vivi drank regularly at dinner, was offered to the usher, but he was expected to refuse. The one who accepted got his pint, but was taught his place by being asked a few moments later in a voice of thunderous irony, "Perhaps you would like a little more beer, Mr. N?" Mr. N, a man of spirit, replied casually, "Well, thank you, Mr. C. I think I would." He was the one who did not stay till the end of his first week, and the rest of the day was a black one for us boys. I myself was rather a pet or mascot of Oldie's, a position which I swear I never sought and of which the advantages were purely negative. Even my brother was not one of his favorite victims, for he had his favorite victims, boys who could do nothing right. I have known Oldie enter the schoolroom after breakfast, cast his eyes round and remark, "Oh, there you are, Reese, you horrid boy. If I am not too tired, I shall give you a good drubbing this afternoon." He was not angry, nor was he joking. He was a big, bearded man with full lips like an Assyrian king on a monument, immensely strong, physically dirty. Everyone talks of sadism nowadays, but I question whether his cruelty had any erotic element in it. I half divined then and seem to see clearly now what all his whipping boys had in common. They were the boys who fell below a certain social status, the boys with vulgar accents. For P. Dear, honest, hardworking, friendly, healthy, pious. P. was flogged incessantly. I now think for one offense only he was the son of a dentist. I have seen Oldie make that child bend down at one end of the schoolroom and then take a run of the room's length at each stroke. But P. was the trained sufferer of countless thrashings, and no sound escaped him until towards the end of the torture. There came a noise quite unlike a human utterance, that peculiar croaking or rattling cry that, and the grey faces of all the other boys and their death-like stillness are among the memories I could willingly dispense with. The curious thing is that despite all this cruelty, we did surprisingly little work. This may have been partly because the cruelty was irrational and unpredictable, but it was partly because of the curious methods employed, except at geometry, within brackets, which he really liked, bracket close. It might be said that Oldie did not teach at all. He called his class up and asked questions. When the replies were unsatisfactory, he said in a low. When the replies were unsatisfactory, he said in a low, calm voice, "Bring me my canes. I see I shall need it." If a boy became confused, Oldie flogged the desk, shouting in a crescendo, "Think! Think! Think!" Then, as the prelude to execution, he muttered, "Come out! Come out! Come out!" When really angry, he proceeded to antics, warming for wax in his ear with his little finger and babbling, "Aye, aye, aye, aye." I have seen him leap up and dance round and round like a performing bear. Meanwhile, almost in whispers, Vivi or the usher, or later, Oldie's youngest daughter, was questioning us juniors at another desk. Lessons of this sort did not take very long. What was to be done with the boys for the rest of the time? Oldie had decided that they could, with least trouble to himself, be made to do arithmetic. Accordingly, when you entered school at 9 o'clock, you took your slate and began doing sums. Presently, you were called up to say a lesson. When that was finished, you went back to your place and did more sums. And so forever. All the other arts and sciences thus appeared as islands, mostly rocky and dangerous islands, which, like to rich and various gems, inlaid the unadorned bosom of the deep. The deep being a shoreless ocean of arithmetic. At the end of the morning, you had to say how many sums you had done, and it was not quite safe to lie. But supervision was slack and very little assistance was given. My brother, I have told you that he was already a man of the world, soon found the proper solution. He announced every morning with perfect truth that he had done 5 sums. He did not add that they were the same 5 every day. It would be interesting to know how many thousand times he did them. I must restrain myself. I could continue to describe Oldie for many pages. Some of the worst is unsaid, but perhaps it would be wicked, and it is certainly not obligatory to do so. One good thing I can tell of him, impelled by conscience, a boy once confessed to him an otherwise undetectable lie. The ogre was touched. He only patted the terrified boy's back and said, "Always stick to the truth." I can also say that though he taught geometry cruelly, he taught it well. He forced us to reason, and I have been the better for those geometry lessons all my life. For the rest, there is a possible explanation of his behavior which renders it more forgivable. Years after, my brother met a man who had grown up in the house next door to Oldie's school. That man and his family, and I think the neighbors in general, believed Oldie to be insane. Perhaps they were right, and if he had fairly recently become so, it would explain a thing which puzzles me. At that school, as I knew it, most boys learned nothing and no boy learned much. But Oldie could boast an impressive record of scholarships in the past. His school cannot always have been the swindle it was in our time. You may ask how our father came to send us there. Certainly not because he made a careless choice. The surviving correspondence shows that he had considered many other schools before fixing on Oldie's. And I know him well enough to be sure that in such a matter he would never have been guided by his first thoughts, which would probably have been right, nor even by his 21st, which would at least have been explicable. Beyond doubt, he would have prolonged deliberation till his 101st, and they would be infallibly and invincibly wrong. This is what always happens to the deliberations of a simple man who thinks he is a subtle one. Like Arles, sceptic in religion, he is always too hard for himself. My father piqued himself on what he called reading between the lines. The obvious meaning of any fact or document was always suspect. The true and inner meaning, invisible to all eyes except his own, was unconsciously created by the restless fertility of his imagination. While the thought he was interpreting all these prospectus, he was really composing a school story in his own mind. And all this, I doubt not, with extreme conscientiousness and even some anguish. It might perhaps have been expected that this story of his would presently be blown away by the real story which we had to tell after we had gone to Belsen. But this did not happen. I believe it rarely happens. If the parents in each generation always or often knew what really goes on at their sons' schools, the history of education would be very different. At any rate, my brother and I certainly did not succeed in impressing the truth on our father's mind. For one thing, and this will become clearer in the sequel, he was a man not easily informed. His mind was too active to be an accurate receiver. What he thought he had heard was never exactly what you had said. We did not even try very hard. Like other children, we had no standard of comparison. We supposed the miseries of Belsen to be the common and unavoidable miseries of all schools. Vanity helped to tie our tongues. A boy home from school, especially during that first week when the holidays seem eternal, likes to cut a dash. He would rather represent his master as a buffoon than an ogre. He would hate to be thought a coward and a crybaby, and he cannot paint the true picture of his concentration camp without admitting himself to have been, at the last 13 weeks, a pale, quivering, tear-stained, obvious slave. We all like showing scars received in battle, the wounds of the ergastulum. Less. My father must not bear the blame for our wasted and miserable years at Oldies. And now, in Dante's words, to treat of the good that I found there. First, I learned, if not friendship, at least gregariousness. First, I learned, if not friendship, at least gregariousness. There has been bullying at the school when my brother first went there. I had my brother's protection for my first few terms, after which he left to go to a school we may call Y1. But I doubt if it was necessary. During those last declining years of the school, we boarders were too few and too badly treated to do or suffer much in that way. Also, after a certain time, there was no new boys. We had our quarrels, which seemed serious enough at the time, but long before then we had known one another too long and suffered too much together not to be, at the least, very old acquaintance. That, I think, is why Belsen did me, in the long run, so little harm. Hardly any amount of oppression from above takes the heart out of a boy like oppression from his fellows. We had many pleasant hours alone together, we five remaining boarders. The abandonment of organized games, though a wretched preparation for the public school life to which most of us were destined, was at the time a great blessing. We were sent out for walks alone on half holidays. We did not do much walking. We bought sweets in drowsy village shops and pottered about on the canal bank or sat at the brow of a railway curtain watching a tunnel mouth for trains. Hertfordshire came to look less hostile. Our talk was not bound down to the narrow interests which satisfy public school boys. We still had the curiosity of children. I can even remember from those days what must have been the first metaphysical argument I ever took part in. We debated whether the future was like a line you can't see or like a line that is not yet drawn. I have forgotten which side I took, though I know that I took it with great zeal. And always there was what Chesterton calls the slow maturing of old jokes. The reader will notice that school was thus coming to reflect a pattern I had already encountered in my home life. At home, the bad times had drawn my brother and me closer together. Here, where the times were always bad, the fear and hatred of Oldie had something the same effect upon us all. His school was in some ways very like Dr. Grimstone's school in vice versa. But unlike Dr. Grimstone's, it contained no informer. We stood foursquare against the common enemy. I suspect that this pattern, occurring twice and so early in my life, has unduly biased my whole outlook. To this day, the vision of the world which comes most naturally to me is one in which we two are we few, and in a sense we happy few, stand together against something stronger and larger. England's position in 1940 was to me no surprise. It was the sort of thing that I always expect. Hence, while friendship has been by far the chief source of my happiness, acquaintance or general society has always meant little to me. Acquaintance or general society has always meant little to me, and I cannot quite understand why a man should wish to know more people than he can make real friends of. Hence, to a very defective, perhaps culpably defective, interest in large impersonal movements, causes, and the like, the concern aroused in me by a battle, whether in story or in reality, is always in an inverse ratio to the number of the combatants. In another way, too, Oldie's school presently repeated my home experience. Oldie's wife died, and in term time, he reacted to bereavement by becoming more violent than before, so much so that Vivi made a kind of apology for him to the boys. You will remember that I had already learned to fear and hate emotion. Here was a fresh reason to do so. But I have not yet mentioned the most important thing that befell me at Oldie's. There first I became an effective believer, as far as I know, the instrument was the church, to which we were taken twice every Sunday. This was the High Anglo Catholic. On the conscious level, I reacted strongly against its peculiarities. Was I not an Ulster Protestant, and were not these unfamiliar rituals an essential part of the hated English atmosphere? Unconsciously, I suspect the candles and incense, the vestments, and the hymns sung on our knees may have had a considerable and opposite effect on me, but I do not think they were the important thing. What really mattered was that I heard the doctrines of Christianity as distinct from general uplift taught by men who obviously believed them. As I had no skepticism, the effect was to bring to life what I would already have said and I believed. In this experience, there was a great deal of fear. I do not think there was more than was wholesome or even necessary. I do not think there was more than was wholesome or even necessary. But if in my books I have spoken too much of hell, and if critics want a historical explanation of the fact, they must seek it not in the supposed Puritanism of my Ulster childhood, but in the Anglo Catholicism of the church at Belsen. I feared for my soul, especially on certain blazing moonlit nights in that curtainless dormitory, how the sound of other boys breathing in their sleep comes back. The effect, so far as I can judge, was entirely good. I began seriously to pray and to read my Bible and to attempt to obey my conscience. Religion was among the subjects which we often discussed, if my memory serves me, in an entirely healthy and profitable way, with great gravity and without hysteria and without the shamefacedness of older boys. How I went back from this beginning you shall hear later. Intellectually, the time I spent at Oldies was almost entirely wasted. If the school had not died, and if I had been left there 2 years more, I would probably have sealed my fate as a scholar for good. Geometry and some pages in West's English grammar, but even those I think I found for myself are the only items on the credit side. But the rest, all that rises out of the sea of arithmetic, is a jungle of dates, battles, exports, imports, and the like, forgotten as soon as learned and perfectly useless had they been remembered. There was also a great decline in my imaginative life. For many years, joy, as I have defined it, was not only absent but forgotten by reading. My reading was now mainly rubbish. But as there was no library at the school, we must not make Oldie responsible for that. I read twaddling school stories in the Captain. The pleasure here was, in the proper sense, mere wish fulfillment and fantasy. One enjoyed vicariously the triumphs of the hero. When the boy passes from nursery literature to school stories, he is going down, not up. Peter Rabbit pleases a disinterested imagination, for the child does not want to be a rabbit, though he may like pretending to be a rabbit, as he may later like acting Hamlet. But the story of the unpromising boy who became captain of the first 11 exists precisely to feed his real ambitions. I also developed a great taste for all the fiction I could get about the ancient world. Quo Vadis, Darkness and Dawn, The Gladiators, Ben-Hur. It might be expected that this arose out of my new concern for my religion, but I think not. Early Christians came into many of these stories, but they were not what I was after. I simply wanted sandals, temples, togas, slaves, emperors, galleys, amphitheaters. The attraction, as I now see, was erotic, and erotic in rather a morbid way, and they were mostly as literature, rather bad books. What has worn better? What has worn better? WORN. WORN. What has worn better and what I took to at the same time is the work of Rider Haggard. Rider Haggard. What I took to at the same time is the work of Rider Haggard, and also the scientification of H.G. Wells. The idea of the other planets exercised upon me then a peculiar heady attraction which was quite different from any other of my literary interests. Most emphatically, it was not the romantic spell of Das Ferne. Joy, in my technical sense, never darted from Mars or the Moon. This was something coarser and stronger. The interest when the pit was upon me was ravenous like a lust. This particular coarse strength I have come to accept as a mark that the interest which has it is psychological, not spiritual. Behind such a fierce tang there lurks, I suspect, a psychoanalytical explanation. I may perhaps add that my own planetary romances have been not so much the gratification of that fierce curiosity as its exorcism. The exorcism worked by reconciling it with or subjecting it to the other, the more elusive and genuinely imaginative impulse. That the ordinary interest in scientification is an affair for psychoanalysts is borne out by the fact that all who like it thus ravenously, and equally by the fact that those who do not are often nauseated by it. The repulsion of the one sort has the same coarse strength as the fascinating interest of the other and is equally a telltale. So much for oldies. But the year was not all term. Life at a wild boarding school is in this way a good preparation for the Christian life, that it teaches 1 to 5 by hope. By hope, even in a sense by faith. For at the beginning of each term, home and the holidays are so far off that it is as hard to realize them as to realize heaven. They have the same pitiful unreality when confronted with immediate horrors. Tomorrow's geometry blots out the distant end of term as tomorrow's operation may blot out the hope of paradise. And yet, term after term, the unbelievable happened. Fantastical and astronomical figures like this time 6 weeks shrank into practicable figures like this time next week, and then this time tomorrow. And the almost supernatural bliss of the last day punctually appeared. It was a delight that almost demanded to be stayed with flagons and comforted with apples. A delight that tingled down the spine and troubled the belly, and at moments went near to chopping the breath. Of course, this had a terrible and equally relevant reverse side. In the first week of the holidays, we must acknowledge that term would come again, as a young man in peacetime in full health acknowledges that he will one day die. But like him, we could not even by the grimmest memento mori be brought to realize it. And there too, each time the unbelievable happened. The grinning skull finally peered through all disguises. The last hour, held at bay by every device our will and imaginations knew, came in the end, and once more it was the bowler hat, the Eton collar, the knickerbockers, and clop, 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 clop. The evening drive to the quay. In all seriousness, I think that the life of faith is easier is easier to me because of these memories. To think in sunny and confident times that I shall die and rot, or to think that one day all this universe will slip away and become memory, as oldie as oldie slipped away into memory 3 times a year, and with him the canes and the disgusting food, the stinking sanitation and the cold beds. This is easier to us if we have seen just that sort of thing happening before. We have learned not to take present things at their face value. In attempting to give an account of our home life at this time, I am troubled by doubts about chronology. School affairs can to some extent be dated by surviving records, but the slow continuous unfolding of family life escapes them. Our slight alienation from our father imperceptibly increased. In part, no one was to blame. In a very great part, we were to blame. A temperamental widower, still prostrated by the loss of his wife, must be a very good and wise man indeed if he makes no mistakes in bringing up 2 noisy and mischievous schoolboys who reserve their confidence wholly for each other. And my father's good qualities as well as his weaknesses incapacitated him for the task. He was far too manly and generous to strike a child for the gratification of his anger, and he was too impulsive ever to punish a child in cold blood and on principle. He therefore relied wholly on his tongue as the instrument of domestic discipline, and here that fatal bent towards dramatization and rhetoric within brackets I speak of it the more freely since I inherit it bracket close, produced a pathetic yet comic result. When he opened his mouth to reprove us, he no doubt intended a short, well-chosen appeal to our common sense and conscience, but alas, he had been a public speaker long before he became a father. He had for many years been a public prosecutor. Words came to him and intoxicated him as they came. What actually happened was that a small boy who had walked on damp grass in his slippers or left a bathroom in a pickle found himself attacked with something like Cicero on Catiline or Burke on Warren Hastings. Simile piled on simile, rhetorical question on rhetorical question, the flash of an orator's eye and the thunder cloud of an orator's brow, the gestures, the cadences and the passes. The passes might be the chief danger. One was so long that my brother, quite innocently supposing the denunciation to have ended, humbly took up his book and resumed his reading, a gesture which my father, who had after all only made a rhetorical miscalculation of about a second and a half, not unnaturally took for cool, premeditated insolence. The ludicrous disproportion between such haranguers and their occasions puts me in mind of the advocate in Martial, who thunders about all the villains of Roman history while meantime lis est de tribus capellis. This case, I beg the court to note, concerns a trespass by a goat. My poor father, while he spoke, forgot not only the offense but the capacities of his audience. All the resources of his immense vocabulary were poured forth. I can still remember such words as abominable, sophisticated, and surreptitious, 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 surreptitious. You will not get the full flavor unless you know an angry Irishman's energy in implosive consonants and the rich growl of his R's, capital R's. A worse treatment could hardly have been applied. Up to a certain age, these invectives filled me with boundless terror and dismay. From the wilderness of the adjectives and the welter of the unintelligible emerged ideas which I thought I understood only too well. As I heard with implicit and literal belief that our father's ruin was approaching, that we should all soon beg our bread in the streets, that he would shut up the house and keep us at school all the year round, that we should be sent to the colonies and there end in misery, the career of crime on which we had, it seemed, already embarked. All security seemed to be taken from me. There was no solid ground beneath my feet. It is significant that at this time, if I woke in the night and did not immediately hear my brother's breathing from the neighboring bed, I often suspected that my father and he had secretly risen while I slept and gone off to America, that I was finally abandoned. Such was the effect of my father's rhetoric up to a certain age. Then quite suddenly it became ridiculous. I can even remember the moment of the change, and the story well illustrates both the justice of my father's anger and the unhappy way in which he expressed it. One day my brother decided it would be a good thing to make a tent. Accordingly, we procured a dust sheet from one of the attics. The next step was to find uprights. The step ladder in the wash house suggested itself. For a boy with a hatchet, it was the work of a moment to reduce this to a number of disconnected poles. 4 of these were taken, planted in the earth, and the sheet draped over them. To make sure that the whole structure was really reliable, my brother then tried sitting on the top of it. We remembered to put away the ragged remains of the sheet, but quite forgot about the uprights. That evening, when my father had come home from work and dined, he went for a stroll in the garden accompanied by us. The sight of 4 slender wooden posts rising from the grass moved in him a pardonable curiosity. Interrogation followed. On this occasion we told the truth. Then the lightnings flashed and the thunder roared, and all would have gone now as it had gone on a dozen previous occasions but for the climax. Instead of which, I find you have cut up the step ladder. And what for? Forsooth, to make a thing like an abortive Punch and Judy show. At that moment we both hid our faces, not, alas, to cry. As will be seen from this anecdote, one dominant factor in our life at home was the daily absence of our father from about 9 in the morning till 6 at evening. For the rest of the day, we had the house to ourselves except for the cook and housemaid with whom we were sometimes at war and sometimes in alliance. Everything invited us to develop a life that had no connection with our father. The most important of our activities was the endless drama of Animal Land and India, and this of itself isolated us from him. But I must not leave the reader under the impression that all the happy hours of the holidays occurred during our father's absence. His temperament was mercurial. His spirits rose as early as they fell, and his forgiveness was thorough going as his displeasure. He was often the most jovial and companionable of parents. He could play the fool as well as any of us and had no regard for his own dignity, conned no state. I could not, of course, at that age see what good company, within brackets, by adult standards, bracket close, he was. his humor being of the sort that requires at least some knowledge of life for its full appreciation. I merely basked in it as in fine weather, and all the time there was the sensuous delight of being at home, the delight of luxury, civilization as we called it. I spoke just now of vice versa. Its popularity was surely due to something more than farce. It is the only truthful school story in existence. The machinery of the Garuda stone really serves to bring out in their true colors, within brackets, which would otherwise seem exaggerated, the sensations which every boy had on passing from the warmth and softness and dignity of his home life to the privations, the raw and sordid ugliness of school. Had not, had, not has. But perhaps homes have gone down in the world and schools gone up since then. It will be asked whether we had no friends, no neighbors, no relatives. We had. To one family in particular, our debt is so great that it had better be left with some other matters to the next chapter.